In September 1965, two armies that had been enemies since the day they were born finally went to war properly. Not a skirmish on a border, not a proxy fight in Kashmir, a full-scale conventional war with tanks, jets, artillery, and ships all fighting at the same time. It lasted 17 days. It ended in a stalemate that neither side wanted to admit. This is every weapon they used. We start with the tanks. First, Pakistan. M47 Patton. America gave Pakistan these tanks in the 1950s. 90mm gun, solid armor, and Pakistani crews believed it was the best tank in the region. At the Battle of Charwinda, Pakistani Pattons fought Indian armor across fields of sugarcane. Some crews fought until they ran out of ammunition. The M47 was not perfect, but the men inside it were. M48 Patton, the upgraded Patton with a bigger hull and better fire control. At the Battle of Asal Uttar, Pakistani M48s ran into a trap. Indian forces had flooded the fields, turning approach routes into mud. Pakistani tanks got stuck, got surrounded, and got destroyed in numbers that shocked everyone. Hundreds of Pakistani tanks were left burning in those fields. Indians called it the graveyard of Pattons. Now, Indian tanks. Centurion. The best tank on either side of the 1965 war. British-built 105mm gun, thick armor. Indian Centurion crews at Asal Uttar sat hull down in prepared positions and picked off Pakistani Pattons at ranges where Pakistani gunners could barely see them. The Centurion outranged and outgunned the Patton in almost every engagement. After 1965, Pakistan quietly stopped calling the Patton the best tank in the subcontinent. AMX-13. France sold India this light tank, and it was never meant to fight Pattons. Fast, small, 75mm gun. India used AMX-13S for reconnaissance and flanking movements, where speed mattered more than armor. In the Sialkot sector, Indian AMX-13S pushed deep into Pakistani territory faster than anyone expected. Sherman. India still had World War II-era Shermans in 1965, upgraded with a French 76mm gun that gave them some fighting chance. Against Pattons, they were outclassed, but Shermans were cheap, available in large numbers, and Indian crews knew them well. In secondary sectors, they held ground and supported infantry effectively. That takes us to infantry fighting vehicles. First, Pakistan, M113 Armored Personnel Carrier. America supplied Pakistan with M113s alongside the Pattons. Aluminum hull tracked enough armor to stop small arms fire. Pakistani infantry rode these into battle across the Sialkot and Lahore sectors. The M113 moved soldiers across open ground under artillery fire faster than any truck could manage. It was not glamorous work, but it kept Pakistani infantry alive long enough to fight. Now, Indian infantry vehicles. Universal Carrier. British-designed tracked carrier dating back to World War II. Slow, lightly armored, and open-topped. These vehicles were never comfortable under fire, but they kept Indian infantry mobile in sectors where roads had been cratered by artillery and fields had been flooded deliberately. Old as they were, they got soldiers where they needed to go. Moving on to artillery. First, Pakistan. M101 Howitzer. American 105mm towed howitzer that Pakistan fielded in large numbers. Standard divisional artillery of the American Army in World War II and Korea. Pakistani artillery crews were aggressive, often moving their guns forward to support tank attacks in ways that surprised Indian commanders expecting more cautious tactics. M114 Howitzer. Heavier 155mm American howitzer that gave Pakistani artillery real range. These guns hit Indian artillery positions, supply depots, and reinforcement roads far behind the front line. Counter-battery fights between Pakistani M114s and Indian artillery defined the Sialkot sector for fighting for days at a time. Now, Indian artillery, 25-pounder. British-designed field gun India had used since World War II. 87mm caliber, towed, crewed by gunners with decades of experience. Available in numbers that Pakistani artillery could not match. Indian 25-pounder batteries supported the infantry fighting around Asal-Uttar and slowed Pakistani armoured advances by targeting the soft vehicles following behind the tanks. 5.5-inch medium gun, heavier British artillery piece that gave India the ability to hit targets at longer range, used for counter-battery work and hitting supply lines. In the Chawinda sector, Indian medium artillery destroyed the fuel and ammunition trucks that kept Pakistani Pattons moving. A tank without fuel is just a very expensive piece of metal. M47 Katyusha, Soviet rocket artillery that India had received in small numbers. Fired salvos of 132mm rockets that saturated a target area in seconds. Pakistani infantry in defensive positions along the Sialkot sector reported that the sound of Katyusha's launching was one of the most terrifying things they experienced in the entire war. Nothing in the Pakistani arsenal fired back quite like that. Next up, jets. First, Pakistan, F-86 Sabre. America gave Pakistan the F-86 and Pakistani pilots fell in love with it. Subsonic, agile, 6 machine guns and Sidewinder missiles. Pakistani Sabre pilots were aggressive and well-trained. M.M. Alam, a Pakistani pilot flying a Sabre, shot down 5 Indian aircraft in less than a minute on September 7, 1965, a record that has never been broken in air combat anywhere in the world since. F-104 Starfighter, the most advanced jet on either side of the 1965 war. Mark II capable, needle-nosed, designed to intercept Soviet bombers at high altitude. Pakistan used F-104s for air superiority and escorting strike packages deep into Indian territory, fast enough that almost nothing India had could catch it in a straight line. B-57 Canberra, British-designed bomber Pakistan used to hit Indian airfields and supply depots at night, could fly higher than most Indian fighters could reach. Pakistani Canberra crews exploited that ceiling ruthlessly in the early days of the war and kept Indian rear areas tense throughout the conflict. 1 T-33 Shooting Star, American jet trainer Pakistan also used for light attack missions. Not a frontline combat aircraft, but Pakistan needed every jet it could put in the air. T-33 pilots flew reconnaissance missions over Indian positions and light strike missions against targets too small for the Canberras to bother with. Now, Indian jets, Hawker Hunter. Britain sold India the Hunter and it became the workhorse of the Indian Air Force in 1965. Fast, maneuverable, 430mm cannons. Indian Hunter pilots flew ground attack missions against Pakistani tank columns and air superiority missions against Pakistani Sabres. The Hunter versus Sabre dogfights over the Punjab became some of the most intense air combat seen anywhere since Korea. Fallen Gnat. Small, lightweight, and incredibly agile. Indian pilots called it the Sabre Slayer after 1965. The Gnat was so small that Pakistani pilots often lost sight of it in a turning fight. 230mm cannons and enough agility to embarrass anything Pakistan sent against it at low altitude. Pakistan had not expected India to have anything this capable in a close fight. MiG-21. India had just started receiving MiG-21s from the Soviet Union when the war began. Mark II capable, armed with missiles. The most advanced jet on the Indian side. Pakistani pilots with F-104s were the only ones who could match it in speed. Its presence changed Pakistani calculations about air superiority for the rest of the war. HF-24 Marut, India's own jet. Designed and built entirely in India, which made it one of the very few domestically produced combat aircraft in the world at that time. Subsonic, 430mm cannons and rockets for ground attack. Indian pilots flew Marits against Pakistani positions in the Lahore and Sialkot sectors. It was not the fastest or most advanced jet in the war, but it was India's, and that mattered. Mystère 4, French-built jet that India used for ground attack missions, flew low and fast against Pakistani tank columns, supply convoys, and airfield infrastructure. Pakistani ground forces learned to fear low-flying jets after a few Mystère strikes on armored columns moving in the open. After that, everyone moved at night whenever possible. That brings us to air defense. First, Pakistan. MIM-23 Hawk. American surface-to-air missile system Pakistan deployed to protect its air bases and cities. One of the most advanced air defense systems in the world in 1965. Its presence forced Indian pilots to fly lower and faster than they wanted to, accepting more risk from ground fire to stay below the missile's engagement envelope. Several Indian aircraft were lost to Pakistani Hawk batteries during the war. 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft gun. Swedish-designed anti-aircraft gun Pakistan used alongside the Hawks to protect lower altitude approaches. Fast firing and accurate enough to threaten any aircraft flying below 3,000 feet. Pakistani gun crews around Lahore and Karachi put up walls of fire that Indian pilots described as some of the most intense ground fire they faced in the entire war. Now, Indian air defense. L-60 Bofors, Swedish 40mm anti-aircraft gun India, used in large numbers to protect airfields and troop concentrations. Light enough to move quickly, fast-firing enough to threaten low-flying aircraft. Pakistani pilots learned to respect the Bofors, and several Pakistani jets were brought down by ground fire during low-level attack missions over Indian positions. L-70 Bofors, upgraded version of the L-60 with better fire control and higher rate of fire. India deployed these around its most important air bases and supply hubs. The combination of Hawks on the Pakistani side and Bofors batteries on the Indian side made low-level flying dangerous for both air forces throughout the war. Now the Navy. First, Pakistan. PNS Ghazi submarine. Pakistan's only submarine in 1965, and it caused more anxiety in the Indian Navy than any surface ship. American-built, it patrolled off the Indian coast and forced the Indian Navy to devote significant resources to anti-submarine operations instead of offensive missions. The threat of a submarine that might be anywhere kept Indian surface ships cautious throughout the war. Pakistani destroyers. Pakistan used its small fleet of American-supplied destroyers for shore bombardment and surface action. On the night of September 7th, Pakistani destroyers shelled the Indian port of Dwarka, hitting oil storage facilities and causing fires visible from miles away. It was the first naval bombardment of an Indian city since independence, and it shocked India into taking the naval threat far more seriously. Now, Indian Navy. INS Brahmaputra frigate, Indian frigate that patrolled the Arabian Sea during the war, intercepting Pakistani supply shipments and maintaining pressure on Pakistani coastal shipping routes. The Indian Navy used its frigates aggressively to establish a loose blockade that forced Pakistan to divert shipping and raise the cost of moving supplies by sea. INS Mysore cruiser, India's largest warship actively deployed in 1965. British-built cruiser that gave the Indian Navy its heaviest firepower at sea. The presence of a cruiser in the Arabian Sea forced Pakistani surface ships to be cautious about operating too far from port. A destroyer runs from a cruiser, and Pakistani destroyer commanders knew it. And finally, small arms. First, Pakistan. M1 Garand, American rifle from World War II that Pakistan still fielded in large numbers. Semi-automatic, reliable, and familiar to Pakistani infantry who had trained on it for years. In the close combat fighting around Sialkot and Lahore, Pakistani infantry used the Garand to clear villages and defend positions against Indian counterattacks. M14 rifle, newer American semi-automatic rifle that Pakistan had started receiving before the war. More accurate at longer ranges than the Garand and easier to maintain in field conditions. Pakistani units equipped with M14s had a significant advantage in the long-range firefights that often developed when two sides dug in across open ground from each other. Now Indian small arms. Lee Enfield, British bolt-action rifle that India still fielded in some units in 1965. A rifle that had served the British Empire for decades and Indian soldiers before that. Accurate and reliable, but slower to fire than the semi-automatic weapons on the Pakistani side. Indian units still carrying Lee Enfields in 1965 were at a disadvantage in the close quarters fighting that followed the tank battles. FN FAL, Belgian designed semi-automatic rifle in its Indian version that gave Indian infantry significantly more firepower per soldier. In the close fighting around Asal Uttar and Chawinda, Indian infantry holding positions against Pakistani armored infantry used the FAL alongside artillery support to stop advances that the Patton crews never expected to face on foot.